Hello everyone. First and foremost, I would like to respectfully acknowledge the traditional custodian of the land where this presentation is being held and pay my respect to the elder past, present, and emerging. I'm incredibly honored to be a part of this important gathering hosted by the South African Professional Society on the Abuse of the Children, an organization that has led the way in structured multi-professional dialogue on child abuse since 1999. And I would like to thank, Janet for offering me this exciting opportunity. This is actually my first ever experience presenting my published work in a formal conference like this. So I'm both thrilled and mildly terrified in the best way. My name is Susanta Bidari. I'm a behavior support practitioner working with Life Without Barriers in South Australia, a wonderful non-profit organization supporting vulnerable individuals. Today, I'll be sharing insight from my article titled Ethical Issue in Child Protection, Systemic Failure and Biasness in Child Protection Agency. And just a heads up, I'll be delivering this via recorded video due to some good logistical barriers. But if you have any question or just want to say hello, please email me on the email address that is provided in the current slide or connect me with the LinkedIn. It's my own name, Susanta Bidari. You can search it in the LinkedIn and I'm happy to respond and get connect to you guys. And I would love to keep conversation going. Before proceed further, I would just like to begin with the acknowledgement of the country. Australian First Nation people are the traditional owner of the land. It is very important for us as a social worker to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians and paying respect to their elder past and present. This is not only a formal courtesy, but also a reminder of the historical and the cultural context in which our child protection practices operate. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander community have endured intergenerational trauma from generation to generation due to the past policies such as child removal policy or stolen generation and on the ongoing inequities. By acknowledging their continuing connection to the country and community, we affirm that cultural respect and safety must be the foundational in the child protection work. This slide sets the tone for the presentation, recognizing Indigenous people's right and the need for the culturally informed practice before we delve into the issue in the child protection system. This presentation contains that may be distressing or triggering for some of you guys. Please prioritize your mental and emotional well-being. There is lots of factors that we can in practice when we feel distressed, such as the importance of the self-care routine, just practicing deep breathing, or just leaving the room if this training or the session is more triggering for you guys. I just speak to someone that you feel connected or comfortable to. By the way, you guys might be wondering about who this guy is, where this guy come from. So, talking about my background, I originate from Nepal, which is a beautiful landlocked country, and there is more than seven tallest mountain in whole world, and we have the Mount Everest, which is the highest peak in the world. So I worked with the different organizations back in Nepal, like the Red Cross Society, UNICEF Nepal, and UNHCR on the program that focuses on the child welfare and the protection. Those experience from running anti-child labor campaign to coordinating with the government on the child right instilled me a deep advocacy passion for the children's well-being. In 2016, I moved to Australia to further my studies in the social work, enrolling in the Master of Social Work at the Flinders University, which broadened my impact. This transition was eye-opening for me. I witnessed how child protection systems differ across the context, but also how many ethical challenges are strictly universal. Working in an Australian child protection agency as a student social worker allowed me to directly compare my prior international experience with the local system. My motivation for this presentation stems from this cumulative experience. I have seen children's life affected by the policy and the practice, and I'm driven to advocate for better, ethically grounded child protection practices. I believe that by sharing my journey and insight, I can help inspire a commitment to reform and culturally sensitive practice among the fellow professionals like you guys. This slide gives a holistic view of the child protection system in Australia. Firstly, Australia has a comprehensive policy framework for child protection. The Safe and Supported National Framework for Protecting Australia Children 2021 to 2031. This framework, developed by the Federal Department of Social Service, lays out guiding principles for protecting children. It prioritizes the children's best interest, meaning every action should benefit the children's well-being and safety. It also stresses the importance of the cultural safety. That means all the services must be culturally appropriate and the decisions, particularly involving the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children, should include consultation with the Indigenous families and the organization first. In practice, for example, this means involving Aboriginal family-led decision making and utilizing the multicultural services when working with the CALD communities. Um, when I was doing the placement, we have the multicultural services here in South Australia who look after for the child intake. Before the intake, they consult with the multicultural team before investigating further. The framework calls for the collaboration across the government, NGOs, and the communities to keep children safe. Legally, child protection is managed by each state and the territory. It has its own legislation, such as South Australia, where I'm based in, have the Children and Young People Safety Act 2017. So this law generally echo core principle like the paramount of the child safety and the duty to support at risk families. Additionally, child protection workers such as social worker or the case worker are bound by the professional ethical standard, notably the ASW Code of Ethics 2020 for the social worker. This code and the public sector ethical code demand the integrity, respect, and the commitment to protecting the vulnerable children and young people. For instance, they require that the worker maintain confidentiality, obtain informed consent, and challenge the discriminatory practices. Unfortunately, while Australia's laws and code are robust, enforcement is inconsistent. The article that I have published highlight that the some standard exists just on the paper, meaning agencies sometimes fail to implement them fully. The issues like the heavy bureaucracy, resources shortage, or the entrenched bias can create a gap between the aspirational framework and the reality on the ground. This set the stage for the ethical issue we'll discuss as the system's strong foundation is not always translating into effective ethical practice on the front line. In this slide, we talk about the ethical challenges that we often find in the child protection agency in Australian context. First is a systemic racism. What does that mean here? It means that the racism is not just about an individual prejudiced remark. It's baked into the system's structure and the outcome. The article and the wider research, for example, by Chris Cunnen in 2019, note that the Australian child protection system and the related system have historically favored the values and norms of the white majority. As a result, indigenous and other minority group faces disadvantages at every turn. Higher poverty rate, incarceration rate, greater surveillance by the welfare and the legal bodies, and ultimately higher children removal rates. Systemic racism can manifest in seemingly uh, neutral policy that actually have disproportionate negative impact. For instance, risk assessment tool might inadvertently flag conditions more common in low income or the indigenous household as a reason for removal without the context. Also, the workforce and the leadership of child protection agency have not been representative of the community they serve. This lack of the diversity means decision-making framework often miss cultural form. This ethical issue here is the violation of the justice and the dignity or the equity of the children and the families from the minority background who are not receiving the same quality of the services or the outcome as others, unfortunately. Instead, they often experience more punitive intervention and less support. Combating systemic racism is not simple. It requires interception of policy, training on the anti-racism, having more indigenous or the culturally appropriate staff, and ensuring the law and the policy are co-designed with the indigenous and the cult community to be culturally fair or the culturally centered practice. The other issue is the exclusion and the mistrust, which goes hand in hand with the racism. Self-protection work ethically should be family-centered and the collaboration. For example, engaging the conversation with the parent, their extended families, and the community in the decision about the child. But in practice, many families, especially marginalized ones, feel sidelined by the system. For example, an Aboriginal family might have their child removed without any meaningful consultation with the child, kin, or the community leaders, even when those support are available. Historically, Aboriginal parents have often judged as unfit based on the mainstream norm without understanding on cultural child rearing practices. This exclusion creates deep mistrust. Families that have been excluded are less likely to reach out for the help or cooperate with the authorities like the Child Protection Agency, creating a vicious cycle. Ethically excluding family voices violate principle of autonomy and respect. Parents, except in the case of proven severe harm, have a right to be involved in the decision about their children. Children also suffer when their family connections are served or ignored. A glaring example is not following the Aboriginal child placement principle, which states indigenous children in care should be placed within the indigenous family or the community where possible. It's the legislative requirement for the Child Protection Agency to be followed. It's under the Section 11 of Aboriginal. Under the Section 11 of Children and Young People Safety Act, which is called the SACP principle. When such principles are overlooked, it causes the cultural loss for the children and the pain for the community, an ethical failure. Rebuilding the trust required transparency, apology for the past wrongs, and involving cultural advisors or the advocate to ensure the families' voices are also being heard. The other ethical challenges is the poor child-centered practices, which is often due to the bureaucratic overload. This issue might be less obvious to the public, but is frequently cited by the social worker themselves. It referred to a culture of procedure before people. Child protection agencies are often under pressure to meet the administrative target, comply with the detailed protocol, and avoid liability. Loan in her paper in 2013 described how an increase in bureaucratic control in different forms, approval layers, risk assessment tool can ironically diminish frontline effectiveness. Worker may spend more time filing out paperwork and meeting audit requirements than engaging with the children and families while in the crisis. The article also gives an example focusing on the documentation can open the door to falsification or omission of record. Why will that happen? Why? It's possibly to make stats look better or to cover the mistake. Both are very unethical responses. It underscores a loss of sight of the child as a person. A child-centered practices ethically will mean that the child voice and the holistic need guide every action. When the practice become rule-bound to the point of ignoring a child's unique situation, say strictly following a protocol even if it doesn't fit that child is an ethical lapse. We also see poor child-centered practice when children in care are not consulted about their moves or decisions, or when siblings are separated because the system lacked the placement to keep them together. There are examples of system convenience trumping child well-being. The ethical principle violated is beneficence, acting in the best interest of the child. In summary, the slide highlight how racism, exclusion, and depersonalized procedure each contradict core social work ethics such as social justice, participation, best interest of the child. This issue demands the changes at both mindset and within the system level. Children in out-of-home care are at risk. It is painfully ironic that the children removed for safety can face new harms in the very system meant to protect them. Research by Fernandez in 2014 found persistent concern about how children are treated in care, including the instances of sexual abuse and the harsh punishment inflicted by the caregiver or the staff. Instead of healing from past trauma, some children experience further victimization in foster home care or the residential facility or other form of placement. The second point is the violation of the right. Reports have documented children in care being denied basic rights such as maintaining contact with parents and the sibling, or even being subjected to the psychological abuse by the staff. These practices violate the principle that removal should strive to provide better care than what the child endured at home. When child is cut off from the loved one without a good reason, or treated with cruelty or neglect by the caregiver, it represents a severe ethical breach. It contravenes the child's right to the family connection and the emotional security, which is in the Article 9 of United Nations, which was published in 1989, and can have the long-term impact on their mental health. And the third point is the high profile failure. Unfortunately, Australia has witnessed shocking cases where children were harmed while in the state care. A notorious example in the South Australia was the abuse perpetrated by Shannon McCall, a former residential care worker convicted in 2015 of multiple child sex offences. He exploited his position to molest children in care, rocking public confidence in the system. This case, among others, spurred the 2016 Royal Commission, which concluded that the system abuse was able to occur due to systemic weakness, like poor staff, betting, lack of oversight, and the culture of silence. And there is an inadequate safeguard as well. This incident highlights how inadequate safeguard and oversight can lead to the ethical issue. Children in care are among society's most vulnerable. Those have many history of trauma which predators can exploit. Ethically, agencies have an absolute duty to care, ensure the placement are safe. rigorous screening of foster carers and the staff, regular monitoring of the children's well-being, and the swift action of any allegation. When that duty is not met, children suffer irreparable harm. Learning from this failure, the ethical imperative is clear. We must prioritize child safety above all else in every placement decision. After the Chloe Valentine tragedy, one of the coroner recommendations was that nothing less than a massive overhaul of staff training and the culture would suffice to prevent such failure. Likewise, in the response to abuse in the care, reform have included stricter caregiver assessment and independent visitor scheme for residential care. However, ongoing vigilance is needed. We as a social worker must champion a culture where any hint of abuse in care is immediately addressed. Children must be heard and believed, and offender held accountable. Ultimately, a system that truly protects that must ensure that being taken into the care never means entering a cycle of abuse again and again by the system who meant to care for their safety. One of the clearest indicators of systemic inequality and in the child protection is the drastic overrepresentation of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children. As of June 2019, about 51,500 Indigenous children were either in care or had substantiated child protection concern, or rate roughly 8 times higher than that for the non-Indigenous children. This disparity has only grown. By 2023, First Nation children were 12.1 times more likely than non-Indigenous children to be out of home care, as per the report published by AISW in 2023. These numbers are not just because Indigenous parents care less, they reflect deeper social injustices due to different form of causes like the historical and the structural causes. The legacy of colonization looms large. Past government policy of forced child removal, such as stolen generation, assimilation, and ongoing socio-economic marginalization, have created intergenerational trauma in indigenous community. Structural disadvantages such as poverty, inadequate housing, limited access to the services contribute to higher involvement with the child welfare. Systemic racism is contemporary policy, and the institution also plays a major role, as per Conan 2019. He also argued that the institutional racism in Australia justice and the welfare system has perpetuated issues like high poverty, substance abuse, and homelessness in the indigenous population. These factors in turn are risk drivers for child protection involvement. And there is the biasness in the system. Systemic racism is not only about the socioeconomic factor, it also manifests within the child protection process itself. Studies suggest there may be a bias in reporting and intervention. Indigenous families are more likely to be reported for suspected abuse or neglect, and once in the system, their cases are more likely to progress to child removal, even when controlling for the circumstances. First Nation family often describe feeling targeted and disrespected by children protection authorities, as per AISW 2023. And there are also numerous accounts of culturally insensitive practices. For example, social worker or the caseworker working in child protection agency failing to understand the kinship structure or child rearing practices in indigenous culture and thus judging families unfairly. A lack of cultural competence can also lead to the misinterpretation of what is truly harmful versus what is simply different cultural tradition. There is workforce and the power imbalance. Another aspect is the whiteness of the social workforce. Walter Taylor and Havivis in 2011 famously asked how white is social work in Australia. This is the public's uh, work that has been done by them, and it has concluded that it is predominantly white, especially in the position of the power. They observed that the social work education and the theory in Australia have been shaped by mostly by the Western patriotism, often excluding indigenous perspective, with the fewer indigenous social worker due to the historical barriers in the education and employment since colonization. Family may rarely see a worker who share their cultural or community knowledge. This can breed mistrust. Indeed, mistrust is a huge issue. Indigenous community have understandable mistrust of the welfare agency given the history of child removal policy in the past. Mistrust can lead to the poor engagement. Family might avoid seeking help or cooperating out of fear that the authority will remove their children. The impact in the South Australia is that these issues are much present. It's not that past issue, it's still present. Aboriginal children in the South Australia are consistently overrepresented in the care. Closing the gap target is to reduce the overrepresentation rate by 45% by 2031. But as of now, South Australia is not on track. In fact, the rate of Indigenous children in care has risen in recent year in South Australia. Locally, we have the organization like Aboriginal Family Support Services, AFS, and the Grandmothers Group advocating for the culturally appropriate practices and the implementation of the Section 11 of the Children and Young People Safety Act, which is Aboriginal Child Placement Principle that prioritizes Indigenous children staying within the kinship or the community. Yet the challenges remain in the fully honoring that principle. The South Australia Ombudsman investigation have also noted failure in how the system engaged with the Aboriginal family, including the poor consultation and the Indigenous elder and the support services in the critical decision. Ethical mandate here is that the ethically combating system racism in the child protection is non-negotiable. This means actively working to decolonize practice, valuing indigenous knowledge, involving um, indigenous practitioner and decision maker, and addressing inequalities or the inequities that lead to child removal in the first place. It also means each of us examining our own biases and power dynamic at play. That's why our role of self-reflection is crucial as a social worker. A child protection system cannot be truly ethical if it continues to disproportionately separate First Nation children from their families. Later, we will discuss strategy to address this, but it's important to hold in mind closing the gap in the child protection is one of the Australia's greatest moral tests in this field. Let's dive into the system failure and the workplace culture. A recurring ethical problem is the tendency of the large agency to become overly bureaucratic. Frontline workers such as like social worker or the case worker working in child protection agency often faces high case load, mountain of paperwork, and the pressure to meet procedural targets. This can lead to the proceduralism trumping the human element in the child protection. When checking boxes become more important than spending time with the child or truly understanding a family situation, a quality of care suffers. Social workers might close cases prematurely or miss sign of risks because they are stressed thin and focus on administrative compliance. The system-driven pressure is an ethical issue because it can cause workers to act in a ways that conflict with the professional values and the thoroughness uh, care and the client-centered practice. The other one is the resource constraint. Many failures are tied to under-resourcing. High staff turnover, unmanageable caseload, and the lack of support contribute to the mistake. For instance, the South Australia Ombudsman in 2023 found that part of why 90 plus abuse report went uninvestigated was the worker said that they did not have the capacity to open the case at all. Similarly, an ombudsman inquiry in 2019 revealed that some serious notifications were screened out or closed with no action due to resource constraint, even when a response was warranted. This systemic failure, not the fault of one worker, but of a system that did not allocate sufficient resources or prioritize effectively. The ethical principle of beneficence, doing good and preventing harm, is compromised when agency cannot or do not follow up on the report of children at risk because of the workload or the funding issue. The other one is a workplace cultural issue. Inside the child protection offices, the culture among the staff can either uphold or undermine the ethics. Unfortunately, my experience and literature point to problems like bullying, clique behavior, and poor supervision. During my student placement in the child protection agency, I observed instances of gossiping about the client and colleague and experienced bullying dynamic. This is consistent with the report of unbecoming conduct within the agency. Such a culture create a hostile environment for the staff and distract from the mission. It is hard to act ethically toward client if the workplace itself is rife with the disrespect and the fear. Moreover, new worker or the student in the placement can be particularly vulnerable in this setting. In my case, I found myself in a complex situation as a student, expected to handle a case without the sufficient support, which AASW guideline explicitly advised against. There is a case example in the Chloe Valentine. You guys can search in the Google and it will come up. The learning from the Chloe Valentine is that the Chloe Valentine case had direct implication for the practice culture. One recommendation from the coroner report was that inexperienced staff less than the 12 month should always be supervised by the senior worker or the senior social worker. This was because lack of oversight and the experience were identified as a factor in the Chloe case. Junior workers were handling complex issues without the guidance. The AASW also reminds the agency that the student on the placement should not carry the full caseload of high-risk cases due to the potential of error and vicarious trauma. However, I experienced a deviation from this. Despite the cautionary tale of the Chloe Valentine as a student, I was effectively carrying cases I probably shouldn't have. This highlights how important lessons often don't trickle down to everyday practice without the strong managerial enforcement. The concept of the ethical climate in organization is crucial, it's very important. And ethical climate means staff feel empowered to voice concern, supervisors moral integrity, and there is accountability for the misconduct. When that's absent, small issues fester into the large failure. For example, if a caseworker is falsifying note or a foster carer's concerning behavior is ignored, colleagues need to feel they can speak up without retaliation. In poor culture, silence and complacency take over. A striking observation from a placement was how some staff normalize unethical practices like casually discussing confidential case details in the public or the stereotyping client because that's how it's always been here. Breaking that cycle requires the conscious effort and the leadership. Lastly, it's worth noting that an unethical environment also burns out good worker. Many start with idealism and their strong values, but if they are met with the hostility or see unethical behavior go on unaddressed, they either become discouraged or had to leave the job. This turnover then exaggerates the system's instability. So the improving work culture is not just nice to have, it's essential for retaining skilled staff and thus for providing consistent quality care to the children and young people. We will later discuss how strengthening professional ethic, support and accountability within the agency can reform this culture. These are the two case studies that I like to give it to you guys, and you can go home and have a look through these cases. So, in the Chloe Valentine case, Chloe was a little girl from Adelaide whose tragic death became a symbol of systemic failure. Over about 2 years, more than 20 reports of concern about Chloe welfare due to the neglect, abuse, parental drug use were made to the agency, which was Family SA back then. And the second case study was the Ombudsman investigation 2011 to 22. Another example is the SA Ombudsman 2023 report investigated by Ombudsman Wayne Lyons. So I would just like you to pause, reflect, and think about these cases. What if you are the social worker working in this case? How you feel? What's the impact on you guys? What's the impact that you can make as a social worker working in the statutory child protection agency? And what reforms that you like to call? The issue that we discussed in the last previous couple of slides can impact on the children, families, and the communities that we support. The ethical issue we have discussed can contribute to the trauma and the trust issue. The ethical issue we have discussed don't just remain abstract. They deeply affect real children and the families. When a child in care is abused or neglected by those entrusted to protect them, the trauma is compounded. Many children in out of home care already carry trauma from their original home situation. Experiencing further harm in the care can lead to complex trauma affecting their development, mental health, and the ability to form healthy relationships. We see high rate of post-traumatic stress syndrome (PTSD), attachment disorder, and the self-harm among children who have unstable or harmful care placement, according to the report that was published by AISW in 2021. Furthermore, children who feel unheard or unjustly treated by the system may develop a profound mistrust of authorities and caregivers that can last a lifetime. The other impact is on the family and community consequences. For families, unethical practices can be devastating. Indigenous families, in particular, for instance, may feel collective grief and anger over the continued removal of their children as disproportionate rate, a phenomenon sometimes termed the new stolen generation as per SNAICC 2023. Every child removal that might have been preventable with better support or less bias is a lost opportunity to heal a um, community and the family. Conversely, failure to remove when children are truly unsafe, as in the Chloe Valentine case, can shatter family and the communities with a tragedy. Moreover, when systemic issue cause parent to lose trust, say due to a worker dishonesty or the discrimination, they might disengage from seeking help, which in turn can leave children less supported. The outcome in the care, statistically, children in long term face significant challenges. Many experience multiple placement breakdown or the placement moves, disrupting their education and the friendship. In Australia, about 45% of the indigenous children in care have continuously in care for 5 plus years as per AISW report, that often without achieving reunification or permanency. Only roughly 16% of children who exited care to the family reunification is one recent year stayed with their family for at least a year without re-entering to the care. The data point suggests that once in the system, children, especially indigenous children, often remain there much of their childhood. This raises ethical questions. Are you doing enough to support reunification and family-based solution? Are children languishing in care because of the system interior or the lack of services to facilitate their return home? A truly ethical system would aim for children to thrive in a stable, loving families, not adrift through the system indefinitely. Intergenerational trauma effect. Unethical children protection practices can reverberate across generations. For example, a children who ages out of care with poor experience may lack trust in the social services as an adult, potentially avoiding seeking help when they have children. This can perpetuate the cycle of risks. Indigenous community note that the removal of the children affect cultural continuity. Every child disconnected from culture and community is at risk of losing language, identity, and belonging. This is why the Aboriginal child placement principle and the family reunification effort are ethically and culturally imperative. Lastly, the broader community impact. include erosion of public confidence in the child protection system when scandals come to the light. If the public perceives the agency as a routinely failing or acting unjustly, there can be a less willingness to report suspected abuse, thinking, what's the point if they won't act? Or less political support for the funding the system. On the flip side, when positive changes occur, it can restore some faith and having some of the hope. For the practitioner, seeing the harm that systemic issue cause can either galvanize moral courage or contribute to burnout if they're feeling nothing ever changes. The stakes are high. Ethical lapses hurt not only individual children but also the social fabric and the credibility of our profession as a social worker. This is why reform is crucial to improve outcome and rebuild trust at all levels. From analysis to action, we advocate for the reform. That's our responsibility as a social worker. Having examined the problem, the question becomes, what can we do about it? Advocacy for reform must happen at multiple levels, within our own practice, within our organization, and the policy of the government level. So, social worker guided by our code of ethics have responsibility to challenge injustice and work toward the social change. First, we need to engage in the self-reflection and the peer discussion about the ethics. Advocacy must include the voices of those with the lived experience of the children protection system, especially the children and young people who grew up in the care, parents who have navigated the system and the kinship carer or the foster carers, or even the out-of-home care residential staff. Allies and the partnership is another collaborative ways that we need to reform this whole system and holding power to account. A key part of advocacy is calling on those in the powers, such as agency leaders and yourself or the legislators, to take responsibility and take an action of the recommendation from the coroner report, AISW report, and all these evidence-based research paper, and also the personal motivation in the advocacy. I think I'm running out of the time, but I'll just try to focus on the key recommendation here. The top recommendation is to adopt uh, and embrace the child-centered practice. Um, why? While it might sound like a buzzword, child-centered care has a specific actionable component. It means that in all decisions, whether it's deciding to remove children, choosing a placement, planning therapy, etc., we actively consider the child's perspective and the wishes. Their voice need to be in every word that we're gonna write on about their history in the child protection system, and or even when you are writing the care plan of them. Um, Practically, this could involve inviting children to participate in the case meeting with support, using the child-friendly communication method to gather their views, or employing the child advocates. The article underscores that the partnering with the children and their families lead to better outcome. When a child feels heard, it can boost their self-worth and the cooperation in the process. Likewise, involving families, especially parents or the kin who are safe and willing in the planning, can lead to more sustainable solution. For instance, a parent might identify a family support or propose a care arrangement that the agency alone wouldn't know about it. And it's also a matter of the right. Child have right to have a say in matters affecting them. As per the United Nations Convention on the Right of the Child, in Australia, inquiries often lament that the system tends to be adult driven. By making it child centric, we flip that script, and we as a professional need to call for the action, especially when you are talking about the child centered practice. The second recommendation in the paper is to address the systemic racism and empower the communities. To reform systemic racism, child protection must become the culturally safe and the responsive agency. This is a big picture, long-term goal, but essential as well. The article recommendation pointed out multi-level strategies such as economic, political and the social. Economically, many issues that lead to the child protection involvement, such as neglect or abuse, correlate with the poverty and the lack of awareness. Indigenous and certain CAL communities face higher poverty rate due to the historical marginalization. By investing in the poverty elevation and the community resources, government can reduce the stressor that often precipitate the child abuse or the neglect. For example, more funding for the family support services, housing assistance, mental ill health, and the addiction program in the disadvantaged communities can prevent crises that would otherwise result in the child removal. Political and the legal equality is another facet, ensuring minority groups have a seat at the table when the laws and policy are made. A concrete measure will be to include the Aboriginal representative in drafting the child welfare policy or on the panel that review the system, similar to how um, Aboriginal child protection peak bodies contribute to reform. The article suggests even changing legal requirement or using affirmative action to increase the indigenous representation in the policy making. Culturally, is about the mainstream society and the system valuing and incorporating indigenous knowledge and the perspective. And also, professional like us as a social worker, we must need to adhere to the code of ethics that is outlined by the ASW, and it's the ASW Code of Ethics 2020, and its the core values is respect for person, social justice, and maintaining the professional integrity. And it's time to act. We have a role in transforming child protection into a system that truly safeguard the children and uphold the ethics. And I'd like to um, draw an attention here. Let's work together. Government, communities, and the practitioner like us to ensure no child is failed by the system and every child in the care is given the safety, respect, and the love they deserve. The future of child protection depends on our collective commitment to the ethical practice and the persistent advocacy for the justice. Journey have changed. We have traveled through some difficult terrain today, examining harm, biases, and the failure in the system that is supposed to protect the children. It can be heavy and disheartening, but it's also the first step toward the change. By shining a light on the ethical issue, we break the silence that allows them to persist. Ethical advocacy call to hold a mirror up to the system and ourselves, even when we see is uncomfortable. This is how change began. Acknowledgement followed and by the action. Integrating head and heart. As a social work professional and advocates, our approach must blend critical insight with the compassion. The head means analysis, evidence, policy, know-how, guide us in formulating the solutions that are sound and feasible. The heart means empathy, passion, and the moral conviction, feels our persistent and connect us to the human side of the issue. When I reflect on my journey from that young person in Nepal, witnessing the community care to the student in the Adelaide, witnessing the system shortfall is this integration of the heart and head that keeps me going. I think of the faces and voices of the children and families behind every statistic and the case file. They deserve our best effort to reform the system. One of the strongest themes that emerged is importance of lived experience. Whether it's the lived experience of the First Nation communities who have endured past child removal, or a young caregiver speaking about their time in the foster care or in the out-of-home care. This perspective must inform our ethics and our advocacy. They serve as a compass to keep reform oriented toward what truly matters. For me, carrying my family legacy of informal social work and my own experience in the field remind me why I do this. I encourage all of us to continually ground ourselves in the voice of those we serve. When unsure of the way forward, ask what are the children, parents, and the community saying they need. That question can cut through a lot of bureaucratic fog and refocus on the core value. Despite the serious issue, I remain hopeful. We have seen positive changes. For example, great public awareness of the child protection issue, government acknowledging the need of the cultural change, and the social work profession increasingly emphasizing the ethic and the human right. Initiative like the closing the gap through the though ambitious gives us the target to strive for and the whole leaders accountable and many dedicated individual perhaps many of you here are working tirelessly to make a difference in children's lives every day, often unsung. Each ethical decision a caseworker makes, each act of cultural respect, each time someone goes the extra mile to comfort a child, to empower a parent, those moments add up. They are a building block of a reform system. I conclude with a call to action. Let's all be ethical advocate in whatever capacity we can. This might mean mentoring a new colleague on a good practice or volunteering in the community program that support families and lobbying for the legislative change. Big or small, action matter. The Aboriginal children and young people need to be addressed as well within the system, and the children of Adelaide and Australia are depending on the adult in their society to do the right by them. We have inherited a system that with flaw, but we have the knowledge and passion to reshape them. In the spirit of hope, I envision a child protection system in the near future where every child feels safe, heard, and loved. Every family feels respected and held, not judged when they encounter difficulties, and every worker feels proud of the ethical quality of their work. Together in a hope, I will end a reminder that we are not alone in this journey. This presentation itself is a part of wider conversation among social workers, policymakers, and the community rallying for the change. By staying engaged, supporting each other, and holding firm to our values, we can transform our child protection system into one that truly protects and empowers. It won't happen overnight, but it will happen if we persist. As an old saying goes, it is easier to build strong children than to repair broken adults. Our ethical responsibility is to build those strong children by creating an environment in which they can thrive. Thank you for joining me in this discussion, and I invite you to be the part of change that our children are that is deeply deserve. And here are the key references, and I'd like to thank to everyone who comes today and being a part of this 2 days conference held in South Africa. And yeah, I would love to connect you guys with the LinkedIn, and feel free to text or email me at any time. And thank you.